Well, joining us now is former Conservative Minister David Mellor. A very good morning to you, David.
Good morning. I can see you down in Dorset, so the wonders of modern technology.
I know, isn't that amazing? Well, it's great to see you. What is your view at the moment? I mean, is this all a storm in a teacup? Is this some of this unreasonable? Is it a campaign against Boris, or do you think he really is on the cliff edge now?
Yeah, I think he's on the cliff edge, and those who are trying to sort of pretend it doesn't matter. It reminds you a bit of what President Kennedy once said of somebody trying to make the best of a terrible situation. He said, it's like a policeman bending over a body in an alley, saying 2 wounds are fatal, but the 3rd one isn't so bad. I mean, all this nonsense about how everybody used to, sort of get pissed Fridays at number 10. I was a minister for 11 years. I spent a lot of time at 10 Downing Street. Do you imagine Margaret Thatcher allowed that sort of thing? Or John Major, who, though he could be good fun, was also an austere kind of guy. Boris, you remember those fascinating pictures when there was some row in some flat that he and Carrie shared in South London, and there were various pictures of the flat and Boris's car outside. You've seen better cars on a tip. And Boris leads a sloppy sort of life. He doesn't believe in rules. And what has happened at number 10 is that all of these people who work for Boris have taken on the colourings of their master. And so you've got this, totally unprepossessing picture of number 10. It reminds me of the late, great Tony Hancock, who, observing a spectacle of that kind, said, "Swipe me, how glittering. How glittering, isn't it, to know that that's what goes on at the centre of British government." I was, as I say, a member of Parliament for nearly 20 years, was a minister for 11 years. I'm disgusted by it. So I can't imagine how people who don't know anything about the way Whitehall works will feel. And I think it's terminal for Boris. Terminal for Boris. Not necessarily because of the parties, but because of all the stuff that led up to the parties. And of course, the other question that people have got to ask themselves is this. The parties may be a way of getting rid of him, the straw that breaks the camel's back. But, there's a real reason for getting rid of Boris, and that is we are sailing into the most serious economic problems this country has faced in many a long year. Inflation going up to 7%. The burden of taxation, the highest for 70 years. The economic prospects are bad. If there's one thing that Boris can't do, it's the economy. So actually, it would be best if he went now and someone better able to cope with what's going to happen later in the year takes over. Everyone else is worried about what happened in May 2020. I'm worried about what's going to happen if he stays in May 2022 and the months after.
David, look, Heather says, as she's tweeted in this morning or emailed in, this is all over the top. These aren't parties, these are drinks with work colleagues. Do we not have much bigger issues to worry about?
Yeah, of course we do. Look, I'm not obsessed with parties. Partygate, if you wanted someone to talk about parties, I'm not your man. But if I'm forced to contemplate people dragging in a cheap fridge, going down the local takeout, bringing a suitcase full of cheap wine and guzzling it in the centre of British government, I'm not impressed. But that is not a reason for getting rid of Boris. The reason for getting rid of Boris has been all the other mistakes along the way, all of the failures to come to terms with what the British people expect from their Prime Minister, and also to batten down the hatches against the economic bad news to come. What we need is a Prime Minister who understands economics and understands also is fundamentally a Conservative. The real problem with Boris is not that he likes to drink cheap wine. We've all of us done a bit of cheap wine in our time. It is that Boris isn't really a Conservative. Boris is an English nationalist. He's a Boris triumphalist. But he isn't a Conservative. He isn't someone who believes in, for instance, keeping public expenditure under control, which he's manifestly failed to do. And so I wrote a piece in the Telegraph yesterday when I was asked to compare John Major with with Boris Johnson. And the problem for John Major was he had all that was required to win against, unexpectedly, the 1992 election. But when you've got an exciting guy like Tony Blair John couldn't raise his game. Well, the same is true of Boris. Boris's showbiz personality, his rock star image, allowed him to win very comfortably the election 2 years ago. But if all he's got is a rock star image without any real seriousness of intent, without any real policies, what does Boris really believe in? What does he really want to achieve as Prime Minister? None of that is clear. And unless the Tories find a leader for whom that becomes clear in the remaining 2 years of this Parliament, the Tories are stuffed. Almost as stuffed as a lot of those guys were on a Friday evening.
In that case, David, aren't you saying what you're saying right now, and others calling him for him to resign, and the media again playing out picture after picture of parties? Isn't that just an excuse for a campaign to get rid of him? And you're just using Partygate as the excuse. In other words, this is a get rid of Boris campaign.
I'm reduced to the status of a commentator these days, but people ring up and ask me my opinions based on my experience, and I give them. I don't have any campaign against Boris. I just look at Boris, and when you actually look back to a lot of what has gone on, look, the highest burden of taxation in this country for 70 years, that's not what a Conservative Prime Minister should be doing. There's a whole host of other things at the heart of government policy that are really the reason why Boris is not suitable to be Prime Minister. The parties, I don't really care too much about the parties. The only thing I would say, though, is if the people of Britain respond to decency, and there's the Queen mourning her husband of 70 years, not drinking cheap wine in the kitchen of Buckingham Palace. And here they are, the night before the Queen lays to rest, and we all to some degree lay to rest, a man who had a very decisive influence, a brave and courageous man who had his faults, but it was essentially a seriously decent, courageous man. He's about to be laid to rest, and they're getting... I can't remember whether pissed is a word I can use on this station, but anyway, I've used it. Getting pissed,
David.
In number 10. It's not good enough, is it?
Look, how much of this is down to the British public? Because, I mean, your view of Boris Johnson hasn't, you clearly didn't think a great deal of him when he got into number 10. But as you say, he was a pop star politician. In a way, he won the trust of the public and got that incredible victory in 2019. Well, it's down to whether the public still think of him as a rock star politician, isn't it? Or whether we're all getting a bit fed up.
You're dead right. That's the question. If you look at some of these recent polls, 70% condemning him. The figures of those who want him to go in 2 or 3 polls over the last 24 hours are disastrous for the Tories. And one of the reasons I think why I was asked to write about the comparisons with John Major, politicians have their hour to strut and fret upon the stage. They have their hour when what they seem to offer seems to be what the country wants. In 1992, I suppose it's ancient history for a lot of people now, but Neil Kinnock capering around at the Labour Party rally like a demented ape a couple of weeks before the polls, people looked at that and said, we don't really want that guy as Prime Minister. Here's decent old John Major. Let's elect him. But then a few more economic issues down the track and in mid-term, John suddenly seemed to be rather a grey man compared with this new exciting phenomenon, Tony Blair. And so the public changed their minds about what they wanted. By the same token, Boris, the rock star who wanted to get Brexit done, has now become a guy who just seems to be completely unable to focus the country on the serious issues ahead. They can't. He's got such a weak cabinet. They can't solve a lot of these problems. They can't solve, people coming across the channel when they shouldn't. Everywhere you look, there are issues that this government cannot grasp. But the big issue, and I speak as someone who was Chief Secretary of the Treasury in my time, the public expenditure figures are horrendous because Boris has let rip public expenditure. Tory prime ministers don't do that. We haven't had 7% inflation in this country for a few decades. Once we get it back, once we get the interest rates on all the borrowings that we've taken and going up, so paying interest becomes one of the biggest burdens on public expenditure. You then need a steady at the wheel Conservative Prime Minister who understands economics and approaches economic policy in a way that Conservatives should. Boris is not that person, so it actually will save the party a lot of trouble if they try and find somebody. I mean, God knows who, but that's another question. If they try and find somebody who can actually address the problems of this country in a sensible, thinking way. We don't need a rock star anymore. We need a solid, serious political leader with a grasp of economics.
But David, isn't it awful that you say God knows who? I mean, another David has already emailed in and said, we might have people in power doing parties and things like that, but we should be thankful we aren't like the USA with Biden and Harris in charge, because they make Boris look like Albert Einstein. And you think of who the Americans have had in charge in the past. What's happened to the calibre of our politicians?
Well, there's quite a lot of good ones on the back benches. You hear guys on the television like Tobias Ellwood, who was a minister, very heroic. He was the one who ran towards the problem when that poor policeman was stabbed to death, when the number 2 guy in the Metropolitan Police got his car and was driven scuttling out of the place. So you've got a brave man there and a sensible man. But he doesn't suit Boris. Boris won't have him in government. There are plenty of people on the back benches who would do a better job than some of those who are in the cabinet, because Boris seems to want people who just go along with him. I mean, what I found is little things that sometimes give you a clue to what's going on. When Boris was all over the place and the public was shouting at him and condemning him, and his opinion poll ratings were awful, I'm talking about last week, okay, they had a cabinet meeting. And, they didn't discuss any of this at that cabinet meeting. It's like the great story of Mrs. Thatcher, having a dinner for her cabinet. And the chef said, well, what do you want to eat, Prime Minister? She said, beef. And what about the vegetables? Oh, they'll have beef too. Well, a lot of the people in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet were not vegetables. Those in John Major's cabinet, they're vegetables, but only on good days.
That was a spitting image clip, David. I remember it well.
Yeah, but you see, this is the thing. Having a good memory helps because, why look in the crystal ball when you can read the book? A famous Labour politician once said. I look back at this stuff and think, my God, there's nothing new under the sun. History repeats itself, someone said.
It does. It
First
was
as a tragedy, second as a farce. This is a farce.
If you had to put money on it, David, when or if will the Prime Minister be gone? I mean, are we talking by the start of the month or what?
Well, it depends, of course, on Conservative members of Parliament, some of whom are very good, some of whom not so good. But, I mean, at the end of the day, there is a basic instinct amongst politicians. I was a politician for quite a long time. That basic instinct is like watching one of those nature films on the telly, survival. You have to survive. And at a certain point, they will suddenly scratch their tails or whatever bit of their anatomy they scratch, and they will say, we ain't going to survive if Boris is still around, and that's when it'll happen. Personally, I think he'll be gone by the end of the year, and maybe quite a bit before it. If he stumbles on, this is the point about John Major. John Major could have gone with honour halfway through his term, and I think if he'd been replaced, say, by Michael Heseltine or somebody, the catastrophic defeat that the Tories suffered in 1997 wouldn't have been half as bad. Instead of which, John resubmitted his leadership to the test. He was voted back in. He told us all it was all going to be different. And of course it wasn't. Because the other issue with Boris is this. It's actually quite difficult to change your fundamental personality, isn't it? I'm sure a lot of us have had to try. It's not easy. John Major couldn't change his fundamental personality. And so decent guy as he was, he didn't appear to be the brightest guy compared to, dynamic, thrusting Tony Blair, who seemed to represent much more what the British voter wanted the Britain to be like. Boris is a showbiz act. What is he beneath being a showbiz act? I don't think there's a lot there. And that's why it would be good. I come back to the essential point. It'd be good if he went. And I mean, if I said to you now, Anne, Stephen, your life depends on telling me 5 things of real substance that Boris Johnson is determined to achieve in his remaining few years as Prime Minister. You're intelligent, well-informed people. Would you be able to tell me? I think of myself occasionally as an intelligent, well-informed, albeit getting older or senile-type old person. I can't think of what he wants to do. And this is where he's got a problem. He needs, with Mrs. Thatcher, I was the youngest minister for 4 years. Margaret Thatcher was not an easy person to deal with, and she used to treat me with even more contempt than my mother did, and that was saying something. But you always knew where you were with Margaret Thatcher. You knew what she wanted to do. You may not have agreed with it, but you knew what she wanted to do. I don't know what Boris wants to do beyond have another drink of cheap wine on a Friday evening.
He wanted to be Prime Minister, I guess, and he got there, but how long do you hold
Yeah, but you see, that's the point.
Yeah.
There are people in life who want to be somebody, and there are people in life who want to do something. I prefer people who want to do something, and I remain to be persuaded that Boris is in that category. But make no mistake about it. It doesn't matter what I think. I'm an irrelevance now. But I tell you, what does matter is what the British people think. And I think
absolutely.
They've had enough of him.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I really do.
Well, we shall be asking. David, really good to talk to you this morning. Thank you very much indeed. What do you think at